Welcome back to Plague Scythe Studios, everybody. Ryan here, finally, with the B-side of the Tone Engineer Valvestate edition. This might just be the most convoluted and crazy rig I've ever put together for this video, as this stereo Marshall bi-chorus setup is inspired by the live rigs used in the early to mid-90s by none other than Meshuggah. It's been quite a while since I've done one of these types of videos, so just as a quick refresher, while the primary episodes of the Tone Engineer are chasing specific bands and actually album sounds centered around one type of piece of gear and, changing it up where necessary if it's kind of a collection episode like most of them have been recently, these B-side, the every other episodes, kind of ride off of gear used in the previous episodes, but it's more of an open-ended and, say like a thrash metal thing was the last installment, or even a country-ish rig with a Mesa Boogie Mark IV. This is not quite a hybrid of the two, but it kind of leans that way because, one, I'm not actually using the same valve state as before. The other valve state, of course, being the 8100, the plug-and-play mean metal machine of the 90s. Absolutely adore that amplifier. This, instead, is its slightly beefier, slightly heavier, and 100% more stereo brother, the 8200. And that brings me into point B. This is inspired by a real rig. In fact, two real rigs that Friedrich Thordendahl and Martin Hagstrom toured with for several years, and presumably, I would guess Jens Kidman would have as well when he was on rhythm guitar duties in the band. But as such, I'll be playing exclusively early Meshuggah riffs because it just kind of felt wrong otherwise. But this kind of kills two birds with one stone, where yes, this is another tone engineer Meshuggah in a way, but it's really not, because I'm not going after any particular album tone. So I get to cover some Contradictions, Collapse type of riffs and all the way up through Chaosphere, again, in some ways. But mostly this is going to show an example of how you can use an outboard stereo power amplifier, or indeed something that has a pretty decent gain channel built into it, and give some ideas for, you know, tones that I think still fit contemporary metal quite well. So the overarching theme of this is taking a stereo capable power amp and cabinet, still driven by a mono distortion channel, and using the included stereo effects loop to have your B sound, so to speak. So where the rhythm guitar tone is always going to be using this amplifier and an outboard pedal for boost, the other sounds you'll hear are going to be using outboard gear going through the effects loop and effectively using this as a glorified clean power amp. And especially for the time, I think this was a genius solution, and it's still a rather affordable one, because compared to some of the outboard stereo power amps, even of the solid state variety, it's kind of hard to find something that is this cheap and still have a decently usable preamp tone at the same time. And I'm not even going to be taking advantage of the chorus or reverb tones on this, though I would like to explore those in a video eventually. Furthermore, the overall distilled signal paths that I'm putting together for this video will be very reminiscent of the real ones used by Friedrich and Morton, and in fact will share some of the same gear. Other times it will not be the same gear, and I will not be doing all this stuff at the same time. I almost attempted it. I thought about breaking out a mixer and routing it all together. I was already running into kind of some noise issues as is, though, so I said forget it. You know, we're going after the tones, and this would work with something like an AB switcher and some line mixers and other things that I didn't feel like dragging out today and making an even more complex rig. And especially for the sake of filming and clarity, I wanted you guys to see exactly what gear is being used at each time, and not just have this mess of cables on and be like, well, this is on, but that one's not, and then the next scene, that one's on, but that one's not. So yeah, you could do this live, because they did. And as we'll get into it, I think you'll see, for the time, especially with the gear that was out there, it was kind of an ingenious way to tour that material, and it was a very good translation from the things that were happening in the studio. For the guitars used in this video, then, it probably shouldn't be too much of a surprise to you that the 6-string portions and the leads were recorded with my old trusty Ibanez RG. This thing has been seeing some mileage on these 90s themed episodes. Tuned to E-flat standard and nothing else. I had this one set up pretty decently with these Dragonfire hex pickups, and they sound just like a little bit better refined version of the stock pickups that are on this, and definitely sounds like an Ibanez still. So very much fits with the theme of the Meshuggah guitars at the time. Then for the 7-string material, I present to you the Not UV77 Universe by Not Ibanez. I did it again. I may have a bit of a problem. This was not a $1,500 new UV77 or especially $3-4 grand used UV7 from the 90s. This is another eBay special that wins the award for me for coming in with the absolute worst setup out of the box, which makes sense. It's a not great bridge design for what I'm trying to do with it, on top of too many adjustment points, but I got it to not play like absolute dog shit. And at least on the bottom, like, I don't know, 4 strings, the rest of it, it's not ideal. But nonetheless, it did the job for these recordings, and I didn't want to go back and forth with different setups and baritone strings on the other one. And just like with the BC Rich Stealth, I legitimately wanted a guitar that looked like this for wall art. So it's a scummy thing. I still don't like this as Ibanez, and it's ripping off a logo, but I do legitimately plan to use these in a more decorative fashion, and I can kind of justify this, especially when we get to use it for a couple of videos, even if it doesn't sound amazing. But that low B flat string, it does the Meshuggah and corn thing, and this type of guitar, this type of setup with the floating bridge and bolt-on neck, super strat scale, it has a tone and it is iconic, and I do still really enjoy hearing that out of this guitar. Of course, by the time that Meshuggah started recording and playing a lot of this music out, they had stickered their guitars to death and even covered some things with tape and changed out some colors of the pickups and knobs, if I remember correctly, some stuff like that. But I think they were eventually restored to original condition by one of their luthiers. But nonetheless, that is the sound of the early Meshuggah records. This is an Ibanez universe on basically every guitar part. So couldn't have done this video without something that at least ripped it off. On the amp side of things, let's address one thing before we even get into the tones, because I know it's going to come up in the comments section if anyone wants to leave a comment about this. The Marshall Valvestate 8200, 8100 that matter, never ended up on a Meshuggah record for rhythm guitars, period. That is coming straight from the horse's mouth, at least on the remnants of the forum posts that can be found online. And I trust that since it came from Friedrich. But based on my ear, especially having spent a lot of time with this amplifier and the 8100, none of the rhythm sounds on Contradictions Collapse,
none.
Hell, all the way up to Chaos Sphere, none of those things sound like a Marshall Valvestate to me. Now, I do get why some people are so adamant about hearing a Marshall Valvestate-like sound, especially on something like Destroy, Erase, Improve, because there is something to that, but it wasn't the amplifier, it was the cabinet. All of the real guitar cabinets that Meshuggah has ever recorded with on album, even restarting with Violent Sleep of Reason after they ditched the digital gear for that one, it was a Marshall 4x12 with most likely T75 speakers on all of them. And so that sound is very much baked in to all their amplifiers, but still a dual rectifier through that cab doesn't sound like a Valvestate, but it is closer than a Valvestate through that cab versus a dual rectifier through a rectifier cabinet. So 100% understand that, but the distortion texture, the gain structure is different across those amplifiers, especially when you boost it with the stuff that Meshuggah was doing. And by all accounts, besides Contradictions Collapse being a modified 2203 and
None.
being on a Mesa 50 cal and Destroy, Erase, Improve and Chaos Sphere being on a dual rectifier, it seems that the only recording that the Valvestate ended up on in a rhythm guitar application was potentially, and I can't find definitive proof of this, but potentially it was on Friedrich Thorndal's Special Defects mixed with the 50 cal. And I can kind of be convinced of that. I do think that the Valvestate 8200 or 8100 was used on some of the bass guitars because I've recorded bass with it now and it has that grindy tractor tone thing going on. So long story short, I say all that because this is not an album piece of gear for Meshuggah. At least it never was by all written accounts. And that doesn't mean you can't get a cool sound out of it. But I think you'll hear, especially with all this gear together, it doesn't sound like the album. It does not chug the same way. It does not have that cut your head off type of, slicey palm mute that the rectifiers do. And that's okay. It's cool in its own right. But this sounds much more early Fear Factory than Meshuggah on album. So having introduced the 8200, this of course will be the fixture across all of these different tones, whether we're using the rhythm channel or not. The other fixture will be my Marshall 1936A 2x12 cabinet equipped with one T75 speaker, which will be one that will be mic'd up for all the rhythm tones. You'll just hear that one exclusively. And then in stereo, I have on the other side a G12 greenback, but I'm going to do some EQ trickery on the stereo stuff to make it sound like the T75 on the other side because they're just not that far apart. Even the 25, 75 watt thing, it really isn't that different in the room. And it can be compensated for with volume, of course, besides some microphone bleed. But big deal because just like the 90s tones would mandate us, we are indeed using a pair of SM57s to mic it up because you're just not allowed to do anything else when it comes to these type of raw and live metal tones. So let's kick this off with the easiest sound of all of them, the rhythm tone. And just like any good gent boy out there, you're going to start your signal chain with something that resembles a TC Electronic integrated preamp. No, I'm not spending $400 to $500 on an original that you can't turn off maybe if I find one for 100 or 200, it's ridiculous. So instead, I'm going to use my Dirtmonger Instruments Night Serpent, which includes that circuit and actually includes the grind and 33 settings on a foot switch, which are barely different. But the reason I liked this is because you do retain the treble and bass controls, and at least for this guitar, and it's going to depend on the guitar and amp combo, but absolutely decimating the bass, just like they would have, is of course the ticket to boosting the, you know, the mid-range and getting the chunk out of the amplifier that you don't want. I also found it advantageous, though, to increase the treble just a little bit, and that's going to depend on the tolerance of the potentiometer, of course. But for this guitar and this combo, this was definitely the way to go, and boosted level all the way up. And those are settings that you may not need to copy if you're going through an 8100, because as I've talked about and actually demonstrated in a past shootout, the 8100, at least compared to mine, and it seems to be the same way across all the samples that I could find, it's tighter, it's brighter, it's higher gain, and simply put, the 8200 just needs more help. So I'm sure you could match an 8100 to sound like this, but I don't think you'd really want to, because this is an inferior amplifier, and when it comes to the gain channel at least. Though, once you do boost this with gain at maximum and of course on OD2, it still kind of has that Valvestate sound. It does bring it more in line with the 8100, so I can kind of see why they would have done this if, of course, their amplifiers behaved in the same way that mine did, which I'm sure it's not too far apart. Otherwise, most of the other controls I left near noon: bass, middle, treble, and volume. Contour, I'm closer to 3 o'clock than not, leaving in some of the, you know, the highs and the mid-scoop content there, but definitely trending more towards that sound. The alternate signal path for each guitarist, of course, utilizes the stereo effects loop, just like I mentioned earlier, and I want to have the master mix all the way up for that use case, although you can pretty much leave it at that as long as you're not using the effects loop on the rhythm application just like we were before. And that's pretty much how they would have had it dialed in, I would imagine, unless they were using this as yet another passive volume. Either way, depending on your gear, you might want to select the 0 decibels option or the negative 20 dB, depending on whether you're using a line level or instrument level. For what I was doing, I found that most of this worked better at the 0 decibels option, but you'll just have to play around with your specific gear depending on your effects loop. The main thing is that on this effects loop, we're not really using it as a loop. We're using it as a return because we're not sending anything out. We don't need to run the distortion effect, the preamp, out anywhere. We're just putting an alternate signal path in here, and it's kind of creating Y, you know, kind of joining together instead of splitting out and mixing into other stuff. While both Friedrich and Martin play the rhythmic, djenty material in unison, only Martin handled and seemingly continues to handle almost exclusively the clean playing side of things, and introduced a lot of those cleaner elements, in fact, starting on his involvement in those earlier albums. And as a result, his signal path is quite a bit easier to digest. So we're going to start with that one. And essentially it involves a lot of instrument and line level gear in almost the cleanest application possible. So by all accounts, he ran a TC electronic compressor pedal into a TC electronic chorus pedal into a TC electronic parametric EQ. Are you seeing the pattern here yet? And used a, at least by today's standard, fairly rudimentary digital effects processor for the echoes and reverbs, delays, all that sort of thing. All of that going between an A-B box and, of course, the output being ran into the effects return of the Valvestate, where basically his A channel was going through the boosted rhythm sound here, the B channel was going through that clean, dreamy, delay stereo thing through the effects return. And it's a really cool way, once again, to have the mono sound coming out of the amplifier and the stereo sound being piped in from a combination of pedals and post-processing. And of course, all that being shared with the same cabinet sound. For my interpretation of that, I'm using the TC Electronic vintage compressor. I can't really tell if he was using some esoteric pedal that I'm not able to identify, or if there was a rack mount version of the compressor that he used, or he was simply wrong in that interview and he wasn't using a TC Electronic compressor at all. It was another type of compressor. Whatever the case, I found a relatively simple one that kind of has the squishy nature of it without going too overboard. And I like this one. I don't have a regular compressor otherwise. I kind of have other things that do that dynamic range job. So I think I'll hang on to this one. I'm quite a fan. And obviously it also matches one of my other vintage inspired TC Electronics pedals. For the chorus, I decided there's no need messing around with this one. I looked around and it turns out the re-release of the stereo chorus plus pitch modulator and flanger is about the same price, if not cheaper, brand new, and especially on promotion, than used versions of the classic effect that has like the purple stripe on it. And this is a really nice sounding chorus. It has kind of that flanger type thing even on the chorus mode, but all the modes are really fun and not being too over the top. You can dial them in from subtle to pretty strong, but nothing sounds gross, and it has a nice vintage analog effect to it. And especially when using a stereo application like this in front of a clean amplifier, it does kind of have that pseudo jazz chorus type thing. And I know that's what they were going for. And it really works with this rig quite phenomenally, because instead of using a parametric EQ to shape the tone, I did nothing, which is not something I normally do, but I was really just doing a sound check to make sure that all these kind of more noisy components are playing nicely together, and plugged it in and just dialed in the sound and was already had my delay effects and everything in, and it turned out that it didn't really need anything. So not only does this suffice for the overall concept of this demonstration, but actually the sound itself was rather pleasing through the microphone. So yeah, more power to you if you want to include some EQs here and there, or use your digital multi-effects to add it. But honestly, just through this flat power amp and the speakers, everything, just it worked. It didn't really need to change the clean guitar sound at all, which is pretty cool. The Digitech Studio Quad V2. If that aforementioned guitar wins worst out of the box setup for me, this might win worst out of the box UI that I've ever used on a rack mount unit, and believe me, there are worse out there. But for one that I've owned for an extended amount of time, it's not great. And I understand they had limited screen real estate, and you can only do so much with so many buttons, and especially when there's stationary elements on there. But the abbreviations, the modes that you have no chance of knowing what they are until you pull up the manual, it's ridiculous. The button combinations you have to press in a certain order to get to things. It's one of those devices where I empathize with older school guitar players who just plug into something and say, you know what, screw this. I'm just going back to a pedal, because that's kind of like how I felt with this, where I just want to scroll to a sound and get it sounding good. I don't want to have to, mess around making, adjustments to blocks and change the signal chain, and to hell with that. Luckily, there are some actually really nice sounds on here, despite this being kind of an antiquated digital unit. And for both of the sounds, I ended up picking kind of a stock preset and making some very minor modifications, changing the input routing to be stereo, as you can see, and dialed up the mix a little bit and just a couple time parameter changes here and there, and voila. Would it sounded good with some more diffused reverb stuff on the end? I'm sure it would have, but this is kind of reminiscent of that very simple type effect that you could expect, not only in a studio at that time, but especially live. And, you know, I think a lot of people would be blown away to know just how many live tones are that simple. They may not spend a lot of time getting it. It's just like, does it do that thing? And, you know, oftentimes you're going to be piping this through a PA, and the drums are probably too loud. The vocals aren't mixed right anyway. This is not going to even be noticeable a lot of the time. So, I mean, it kind of makes sense. But even on recording in isolation, it sounds really, really nice, and I was very happy with it. So it was fun to get a little bit of use out of this thing, and the overall aesthetic just kind of worked. In contrast, Mr. Thorndahl's rig was so complex that he opted to carry around a printout to show the various layouts of his signal chain so he could adequately describe them to press at the time, or just avoid describing it altogether. And at first glance, it does look kind of batshit crazy and overwhelming, but if you kind of think about it in a fractal audio patch or, you know, a Line 6 Helix preset kind of mindset, it's not doing anything too crazy. It's just taking a lot of gear to you know, do some of the sums and the splits that we take for granted in a digital audio signal chain. So ultimately, just like with Morton's rig, the A side on one of his, you know, A/B selector switches is just going to be the boost channel, once again boosted by that TC Electronic integrated preamp. Once again, nothing crazy there. The B side though, instead of going for a clean sound that is ultimately a modified DI sound, in fact, I think a lot of Morton's kind of on-album tones didn't use a cabinet at all by the sounds of it. Friedrich's lead sound, on the other hand, was basically straight up Alan Holdsworth ripoff with the gear that he had at the time. And I can say that because my lead sound on the previous EP I recorded was also Alan Holdsworth ripoff, because I was ripping off some of the tricks that Friedrich used, using this amplifier exactly, in fact. So at the core of his lead sound, just like on some of Alan Holdsworth's material, he employed the Mesa Boogie 50 caliber plus which by all accounts seems to be a stripped down version of a lot of the same circuit topology used in the Mesa Boogie Mark series. So it's somewhere between like a Mark III and Mark IV sound, but it doesn't have all the bells and whistles, and it kind of has a bit more of a dry gain structure and texture, almost comparable to a rectifier, but still having that tight plug straight into the amp kind of capability that this does, obviously including the graphic EQ. Not nearly as capable as a Mark Series amp again, but these can purportedly do most of what those do and not the other way around. So for me, not owning a 50 cal, though I would like to get my hands on one day, I decided, well, this makes perfect sense to use for this application. And in fact, it looks like that when they switch to Axe Effects products, he continues to use the USA lead models, which is the Mesa Mark IV, in that stead. And it pretty much, it still sounds like him, right? So that makes sense. Also in the vein of Alan Holdsworth, who once upon a time used this same series of pedals, Friedrich boosted that amplifier with the booster and line driver and distortion from the classic line of TC Electronics pedals. This is indeed the original one where you have to have the goofy little 3.5 mil jack like you're plugging into a Zune. And this sounds exactly the same as my reissue that I also used on the leads, because it's a great rhythm pedal. Like, it actually sounds wonderful in front of the Mark series because that's doing a lot of the EQ sculpting for you. But especially as a lead sound, when you don't put it on the distortion setting, leave it on boost, you just get this really clean, unfiltered guitar signal with a lot of boost, and the frequency sculpting is gentle to where it doesn't sound artificial. It just kind of sounds like you're taking some junk out of the signal, which I think is what you want. So this thing is not going to stand up. I think it's no wonder that, they use one of these, and it does have a fairly functional noise suppressor built in. On this one, my vintage reissue actually does not work with that feature, but nonetheless, this is kind of the only thing that's boosting the amplifier up front. For the amplifier itself, then, I actually opted for some more conservative and one could say flip-flopped settings compared to my normal Mark series settings. This is left on the simulclass and harmonics and, pin-toed settings that you would normally have this amplifier on. I'm not trying to go after the Mark IIc Plus tone at all. But on the lead channel, I did not have pull fat engaged, I did not have pull bright engaged, and I did not have the presence shift engaged. So this is kind of like the vanilla flavor of the amplifier. I cranked mids because I wanted as much of that vocal mid content as I could get, and dialed in treble and bass to get the kind of gain that I wanted out of it in conjunction with how much frequency content I was, pumping out of the booster pedal. And honestly, I think I could have dialed down treble a little bit. It got a little grainy on some things, but, again, this is as much of a demonstration of the overall signal chain as it is going after a similar Meshuggah tone, and I really still like the way it turned out. I have lead drive and lead gain completely cranked, which again, maybe one of those could be turned down if you turn the pedal gain up. But the real oddball here is the graphic EQ. I'm sure most of you are used to seeing the 750 hertz slider in particular completely tanked, and I have it almost completely maxed out to achieve some of the more mid-focused and vocal frequencies that are really critical to achieving that Holdsworth style solo sound. And it really complements the cleans on its own. It really complements the scooped out rhythm guitar. So I really dig that kind of layered approach, especially when the wet effects get put in. So to achieve that, I have the lowest and highest sliders a little bit below the center position, 240 hertz barely below the center position, 750 almost all the way up to the first line, and 2200 about a hair's width above the 2200 middle line on the bottom here. So again, going for kind of a lopsided slope that maximizes in the upper mids. So this on its own is nothing special. Old news, right? Got a Mesa Boogie amplifier going through a Marshall cabinet. What's so crazy here other than the settings? Well, because we have a Mesa Boogie amplifier going through a Marshall amplifier going through a Marshall cabinet. And you might recall a very, very old video where we talked about amp slaving. And just like some of the examples I showed previously, we have to make use of a reactive load box on here. Now with Friedrich's rig, he actually used a Rocktron juice extractor, if I remember correctly, and that didn't really do the same thing. It's not nearly as reactive, but we're going to offset that since I do have a real reactive load, and that is what this amplifier will be plugging into in lieu of a speaker cabinet, because this portion is actually on its own silent or line level for the output. This amplifier has a slave output, which it's kind of designed to run into a satellite power amp, or indeed there's like a stereo loop on this thing to be able to send one and then turn one to a left channel, turn one to a right channel, whatever. But the way we're using this is something you could do with most of these types of amplifiers, and really you could do it with any amplifier if you have this load box, because this also has a slave or DI output. So we're essentially turning this into a glorified pedal that has all the tube bits in it. And then we're going to use that line level output either from the slave output here or the output from the reactive load, the DI output that is, and run that into the rest of our effect signal chain. Like the last signal chain, Friedrich also apparently ran a parametric EQ after this, and in fact this was a stereo parametric EQ, but I'm kind of taking care of everything I wanted EQ-wise with this graphic EQ here, so I didn't think it was necessary to bust all that out, so I just left it alone there. Instead, the mono output of this DI load box, or indeed you could do it off the slave output here, either way, is going into the Digitech Studio Quad V2, and we've got a stereo output. This is going to be attempting to mimic some of the tap tones that come off of the multi-tap ADA delay that Friedrich apparently used all the way through the late 90s and possibly even into the early 2000s. Wouldn't shock me if that was the tone on Nothing, because it kind of sounds that way still in the first recording. But nonetheless, we're shooting for a bit more of a multi-tap tone. Again, very Holdsworth sounding here. And so I found a rhythmic multi-tap patch and again made a few minor adjustments to delay length and overall mix. Really turned this high up in the mix, but I didn't really have the trails that long, or indeed any one particular delay last that long, and that's something I don't normally do. Normally I like a very washed out tail, something that kind of blends into reverb and is really diffused, whereas here it was kind of shorter, and once it was done, it's done. But the frequency of notes being played and the tempo of the songs and the stuff going on in the background, it just worked. And, you know, playing through it, it was like, this isn't super inspiring. But once I reamped the solo lines, it's like, oh shit, like that's it. That's kind of what I was going for. And I didn't even realize it till you hear it in context. So that alone is a cool little departure from things I would normally do, where it's, you know, very ping-pongy, and I'm gonna have to play a little bit more with multi-tap stuff again. I had a phase where I was really into it, kind of grown out of it again, but it's very inspiring to hear that. So if this little used guy, 1U cheap rack unit, at least cheap by today's standards, I know this thing was not cheap when it first came out, can pull off multi-tap, then, you know, I don't think there's really a big excuse. You can find something that does multi-tap. And same deal as the last rig. This runs right into the stereo return of the Valvestate 8200. Use its effects loop and drive the cabinet. So that does it for what will probably be the last Valvestate themed video for a while. I wouldn't mind taking a look at some of the other features of this amplifier that, I've not dove into too deeply when it comes to the effects and, the onboard chorus and stuff like that. But you've pretty much seen the ways that most metalheads would use this kind of amplifier to make up for some of the deficiencies versus the 8100. So with that, I guess we will see you next time with some more specialized tone engineers and a few back-to-back editions that we'll have to deal with my music instead. In the meantime, if you have any other questions or comments, please leave them down below, and we will see you then. Bye.